Tell a manager their new hire is exceptionally talented, even if that's not true yet, and something strange happens. The manager starts treating that person differently, and the person often becomes more talented as a result. This is the Pygmalion effect, first demonstrated in a famous 1968 study by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson, originally conducted in elementary school classrooms. Teachers were told certain randomly selected students were expected to show unusual academic growth that year. Those students weren't actually different from their classmates. The selection was random. Yet, by year's end, the randomly chosen students showed measurably higher test score gains than their peers. Nothing changed except the teacher's expectation. Teachers unconsciously gave those students more attention, more encouragement, more challenging material, and more patience when they struggled, all because they believed those students were destined to succeed. Here's what makes this finding so unsettling. No teacher was told to treat any student better. No one was instructed to smile more at one child or call on another more often. The behavior change was invisible, even to the teachers doing it. Researchers who studied this pattern afterward broke the mechanism into 4 rough channels, sometimes called the 4-factor model of expectancy effects. Teachers created a warmer emotional climate around students they expected to succeed. They gave those students more material to learn, and harder material at that. They gave those students more chances to respond and participate, and they gave more detailed, more encouraging feedback when those students got something wrong. None of these 4 channels requires a single explicit word about who is talented and who isn't. They leak out through tone, timing, and attention, which is exactly why the effect is so hard to notice from the inside. Rosenthal's interest in expectancy effects actually started before the classroom study, in earlier research on how a researcher's own expectations could subtly bias the behavior of laboratory animals running through mazes, with experimenters who expected faster rats unconsciously handling and timing those rats in ways that produced faster results. That earlier line of work is what led Rosenthal to ask whether the same invisible bias could shape how a teacher treats a child, and later, whether it could shape how a manager treats an employee. The through line across all of it is the same. Whoever is doing the expecting rarely believes they are doing anything differently, and the person being expected of rarely realizes why the room suddenly feels warmer, harder, or colder around them. It helps to sit with each of those 4 channels one at a time, because they sound abstract until you picture them in an actual room. The climate channel is the warmth in someone's voice and posture when they talk to you, the difference between a manager who leans in and one who checks their phone. The input channel is the sheer amount of material someone is handed, the difference between being taught 3 techniques this quarter and being taught 1. The output channel is how often you're invited to answer, contribute, or pitch an idea out loud, versus how often you're talked over or skipped. The feedback channel is whether the correction you get after a mistake is a full sentence explaining what to try next time, or a clipped, not quite, try again, with nothing else attached. None of these 4 things ever shows up on an org chart or a performance review template, and that's precisely why they're powerful. They're the informal curriculum every employee is silently enrolled in from day one, and 2 employees doing identical work can be getting wildly different versions of that curriculum without either of them, or their manager, consciously deciding to run the experiment. The effect has been reproduced in workplace settings too, and this is where it gets directly useful for anyone managing people. Managers told a new employee tested unusually high on potential tend to assign that employee more visible projects, offer more coaching, and interpret ambiguous mistakes more generously. The employee, sensing that confidence, often rises to meet it. Picture a scenario that plays out in offices constantly. 2 employees join a team on the same day, with similar resumes and similar interview performance. One gets introduced to the team as a rising star, the other gets a plain, neutral introduction. Nothing else is officially different. But over the following months, the first employee tends to get pulled into more strategic conversations, gets more direct feedback instead of vague feedback, and gets the benefit of the doubt when a deadline slips. The second employee doing comparable work quietly gets less of all 3. Neither employee did anything to earn or lose that treatment. The label did the work. Promotion cycles show the same pattern in a slightly different shape. Imagine a calibration meeting where managers rank their people before annual reviews. One manager describes an employee as solid but not quite leadership material yet. A throwaway phrase nobody in the room really interrogates. That phrase doesn't just describe the employee, it starts shaping which projects get routed to them for the rest of the year, which stretch assignments they're considered for, and which meetings they get invited into to build visibility. A year later, when that employee genuinely hasn't shown leadership behavior, the original phrase gets treated as having been correct all along, when in reality it may have simply closed off most of the opportunities that would have produced that behavior in the first place. The forecast and the outcome become impossible to tell apart from the inside. This is not a uniquely modern discovery, and it connects to a much older idea in sociology called the self-fulfilling prophecy, a concept the sociologist Robert K. Merton described decades before Rosenthal ever ran his classroom study. The core insight is the same. A false definition of a situation evokes new behavior that makes the originally false idea come true. Believing a bank is unstable can cause a run on the bank that actually makes it unstable. Believing an employee is a future leader can cause the exact coaching and access that turns them into one. The Pygmalion effect is really a specific, well-documented case of this broader pattern, transplanted first into classrooms and then into workplaces, boardrooms, and performance review cycles everywhere. It's also worth separating the Pygmalion effect from two cousins it frequently gets confused with, because managers benefit from knowing which one they're actually dealing with. The halo effect, first described by the psychologist Edward Thorndike, is different. It's the tendency to assume that because someone is good at one trait, like being articulate in meetings, they must also be good at unrelated traits, like technical judgment or reliability. The halo effect distorts your perception of someone's current abilities right now. The Pygmalion effect goes further. It actually changes their future abilities, because your distorted perception changes how you treat them, which in turn changes what they eventually become. A halo can exist for years without altering the person it's cast on. A Pygmalion effect can't help but alter them, because it's expressed through action, not just impression. Stereotype threat is a related but distinct phenomenon, made well known through decades of psychology research, where simple awareness of a negative stereotype about your own group can itself impair your performance on a task tied to that stereotype, even without any manager doing anything at all. Someone who's aware their group is stereotyped as weaker at a particular skill can underperform on exactly that skill under evaluation pressure, purely from the mental load of managing that awareness, independent of any actual gap in ability. Layer that on top of a manager who has also, even subtly, absorbed the same stereotype, and the two effects compound. The employee is fighting an internal handicap while also receiving a smaller share of the 4 channels of encouragement described earlier. All 3 effects share a common thread worth remembering. Performance is not a fixed, purely internal quantity that sits inside a person waiting to be measured. It bends under the weight of expectation, whether that expectation comes from a label, a stereotype, or simply how a manager behaves in an ordinary Tuesday meeting. Now here's the part nobody expects, and it's arguably more important for managers than the positive version of this story. The opposite effect is just as real and far more damaging, sometimes called the Golem effect, named after the folklore creature that turns destructive when handled wrong. Low expectations, communicated subtly through less attention, less trust, or less benefit of the doubt, can quietly shrink someone's actual performance over time. A manager who privately decides an employee is mediocre will, without ever saying so, start giving that employee less interesting work, less detailed feedback, and less patience with mistakes. The employee gets less practice at the hard stuff, gets vaguer coaching, and starts to internalize the very judgment that was never spoken aloud. Over several review cycles, this can compound into something that looks like objective evidence, a documented pattern of smaller wins, thinner project history, and lower ratings, all of which get cited later as proof the original judgment was accurate, when the judgment itself quietly manufactured a large share of the gap it claims to describe. Neither effect, positive or negative, requires anyone to say anything out loud. Expectations leak through tone, opportunity, and patience, not just words, which is exactly why so many managers believe they are being perfectly fair while running 2 very different management styles on 2 different people at once. Consider a second illustrative scenario. the kind that shows up in performance review cycles everywhere. A manager privately writes off a team member early, maybe after one shaky presentation in month 1. From that point on, without any conscious decision to punish the person, the manager stops including them in brainstorming sessions where ideas get tested out loud, starts giving feedback that's shorter and less specific, and starts double-checking their work more visibly than anyone else's. The employee notices the reduced trust, even if they can't name it, and starts playing it safe instead of taking initiative, which is exactly the behavior that confirms the manager's original, unspoken judgment. A single shaky presentation becomes a self-reinforcing loop that has nothing to do with the employee's actual ceiling. Cross-functional work makes the same dynamic even easier to miss, because the manager, quietly running it, may not even be the employee's direct boss. Picture a product manager who needs a designer and an engineer from another team for a joint project. If a colleague mentions in passing that the engineer is reliable but not very creative, the product manager may unconsciously start bringing every creative decision to the designer instead, even on problems the engineer was fully capable of solving. The engineer notices they're rarely asked for input beyond execution, starts offering less of it, and after a few projects, the second-hand reputation looks confirmed. Nobody in that chain set out to limit anyone. A single offhand comment, passed through a manager who had no independent read on the person at all, did the same work a formal Golem effect does inside one reporting line. For managers, the practical lesson isn't naive positivity, and it isn't about pretending every employee is equally ready for every assignment right now. It's that the belief you privately hold about someone's potential shapes the environment you build around them, and that environment often becomes a self-fulfilling forecast. The useful move is to notice when you've quietly filed someone into a "not there yet" category, and to check whether you're still giving them the 4 things the research points to: a warm, engaged tone in your interactions, real opportunities to take on harder material, real chances to speak up and contribute, and specific, generous feedback, rather than vague or clipped comments. These are checkable behaviors, not vague attitudes, which means you can actually audit yourself against them in a normal week. Ask whether you're giving the same quality of feedback to your strongest and weakest performers, or whether one group gets detailed coaching while the other gets a quick thumbs up or a quiet correction. Ask whether you're handing out stretch assignments based on demonstrated performance or based on a first impression that hardened into a permanent label sometime in the first month. A few concrete habits make this easier to catch in real time rather than a year later in hindsight. Before a calibration or review meeting, write down one sentence describing each person's potential before you look at anyone else's notes, and check afterward whether your sentence was shaped by their actual output or by a first impression from months ago. In one-on-ones, track roughly how much airtime each direct report gets over a month, since output channel imbalances are often invisible until they're written down. When you catch yourself giving quick, thin feedback to one person and detailed, patient feedback to another for a comparable mistake, treat that gap itself as the signal worth investigating, not just the mistake. And, when a rotation or stretch project comes up, deliberately consider the person you'd normally skip past, not because fairness demands it as a formality, but because skipping them is usually the mechanism that keeps the original judgment permanently unfalsifiable. Here's my own take on why this matters more for managers than almost any other bias on the list. Most cognitive biases just distort your judgment. This one distorts the outcome you're judging. A hiring manager with a bad gut read on a candidate is wrong about a fact that already exists. A manager running an unconscious Pygmalion or Golem effect is actively manufacturing the fact they'll later point to as evidence they were right all along. That's a much harder trap to notice, because the proof shows up months later, and it looks exactly like objective performance data instead of the residue of how someone was treated from day one. It's also why "just be more objective" is such weak advice here. Objectivity assumes the data you're judging was collected under identical conditions for everyone, and the entire point of this effect is that it wasn't. 2 employees can have genuinely different performance records by the time of a review, and one of those gaps can be substantially explained by which one got the warmer climate, the harder input, the more airtime, and the richer feedback for an entire year, not by any difference in what they walked in the door with. The practical takeaway is simple enough to apply this week. Pick one person on your team you've quietly underestimated, even a little, and give them one piece of harder work before you feel fully confident they're ready for it. Pair that stretch assignment with the same detailed, patient feedback you'd automatically give your top performer, not a watered-down version. Watch what happens over the following month, not just to their output, but to how much initiative they start taking once they sense you actually expect more from them. That one deliberate shift in your own behavior is the only lever in this entire story that you actually control. And it's the one most likely to change where that person ends up a year from now. You can't directly control someone's raw talent, their confidence, or how a stereotype makes them feel walking into a room. You can control the climate you offer them, the difficulty of what you hand them, how often you ask for their input, and how much detail you put into your feedback. And those 4 things, quietly repeated over months, are exactly what the research says moves the outcome. Follow for more theories that actually explain your workplace.